The ballroom of Washington's National Guard Armory blazed with light on the evening of March 29, 1952. 2,000 Democrats in tuxedos and evening gowns had paid $100 a plate to attend the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner, the party's most important fundraising event of the year. They came expecting a routine political speech. They came expecting their embattled president to fire them up for the coming election. They had no idea they were about to witness history. At the podium, President Harry Truman gripped his prepared text with both hands. His round, wire-rimmed glasses caught the glare of the spotlights. The crowd hushed as he began to speak, his Missouri twang carrying through the cavernous hall. For 26 minutes, he delivered what sounded like a campaign speech, attacking Republicans, defending his record, rallying the Democratic faithful. Then, at the very end, he paused. What he said next would shock the nation. A decision so unexpected that even his closest advisors sat stunned in their chairs. A withdrawal so sudden that it would change the course of American history. But why? Why would a president who could legally run again, who was exempt from term limits by the 22nd Amendment's grandfather clause, simply walk away? Why would a fighter who had pulled off the greatest upset in presidential history just 4 years earlier suddenly surrender without a real battle? The history books will tell you he was unpopular. They'll tell you the polls looked bad. They'll tell you he was tired, that he wanted to go home to Missouri. They're not lying, but they're not telling you the whole truth. What President Harry Truman understood on that March evening, what the crowd in that ballroom didn't yet know, was that sometimes the most powerful decision a leader can make is knowing when to step aside. Sometimes strength looks like surrender. Sometimes victory means walking away. The real reason Truman didn't run in 1952 wasn't just about polls or health or age. It was about something far more devastating, far more personal, and far more revealing about the cost of power. This is the story of how a failed shopkeeper Truman rose to the most powerful office on earth, made decisions that saved and destroyed millions of lives, and then made one final choice that might have been the hardest of all. To understand why President Harry Truman walked away from power in 1952, we have to go back 7 years to an afternoon in April of 1945. Picture this. A man stands in a cramped Senate office, his hands shaking as he hangs up the telephone. He's just been summoned to the White House. Urgently, he has no idea why. As he rushes through the halls of the Capitol, his mind races with possibilities. Is something wrong with the war effort? Has something happened to President Roosevelt? When he arrives at the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt places her hand on his shoulder. "Harry," she says softly, "the president is dead." The room seems to spin. Harry, a failed shopkeeper, Truman, from Independence, Missouri, a man who had been vice president for just 82 days, a man who had met privately with President Franklin Roosevelt only twice since inauguration, is now the President of the United States. And he's terrified. Within hours, Harry Truman would learn secrets that would make his blood run cold. He would discover that America possessed a weapon of unimaginable power, something called an atomic bomb. He would inherit a war on 2 fronts, with Japan still fighting and American soldiers still dying by the thousands. He would face off against Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, giants of world history, who viewed him with undisguised contempt. One reporter would write, "The presidency is too big for him." Stalin reportedly called him that little shopkeeper. Even Truman's own mother-in-law didn't think he was qualified for the job. But what everyone missed, what they couldn't see beneath the rumpled suits and plain-spoken manner, was that Harry Truman possessed something far more valuable than charisma or pedigree. He possessed the ability to make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. On August 6, 1945, he authorized the dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. The war ended. Over 100,000 Japanese civilians died instantly. Millions of American and Japanese lives were likely saved by avoiding a land invasion. Truman never apologized. He rarely even spoke about it. Years later, when asked if he had any regrets, he simply said, "I made the only decision I could have made." This was the man who stunned America in November of 1948 by defeating Republican Thomas Dewey in what remains the greatest upset in presidential election history. Every poll, every expert, every newspaper, including the famous Chicago Tribune headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," had been wrong. The failed shopkeeper Truman had proven them all wrong. But victory comes with a price, and by 1951, that price was Act Two, rising tension. Everything collapses. 4-10. The first blow. The first blow came from a war Truman thought would be quick and clean. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Truman made his decision within days. America would intervene. The United Nations would support the action. This would be a police action, not a war. American forces would push the communists back, reunite Korea, and be home by Christmas. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By November of 1950, with United Nations forces pushing deep into North Korea toward the Chinese border, General Douglas MacArthur assured Truman that China would not intervene. MacArthur, the great hero of World War II, the man who had accepted Japan's surrender, was so confident that he told the president there was very little chance of Chinese involvement. Within days, 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River into North Korea. American forces, caught completely off guard, began the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Thousands died in the brutal winter. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had become a grinding, bloody stalemate with no end in sight. And then Truman faced an impossible choice: obey a general who wanted to expand the war into China, possibly triggering World War II and nuclear annihilation, or fire the most popular military commander in America. On April 11, 1951, President Harry Truman relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command. The reaction was volcanic. Republican Congressman Joe Martin called it impeachable. Senator Robert Taft thundered that Truman had committed the greatest mistake in American history. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, addressing a joint session of Congress where he delivered his famous line, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Truman's approval rating, already damaged by the war, collapsed. By late 1951, polls showed his approval at just 22%, the lowest rating ever recorded for a sitting president. Lower than Nixon during Watergate, lower than any president before or since. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. While Truman battled MacArthur and the Korean War, another enemy emerged from within his own government: corruption. The word spread through Washington like wildfire in 1951. Tax collectors on the take, bribes in the Bureau of Internal Revenue, Kickbacks in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Presidential aide Harry Vaughn accepting freezers as gifts from businessmen seeking government favors. Senator Estes Kever of Tennessee, a tall, folksy Democrat who wore a coonskin cap at campaign rallies, launched televised investigations into organized crime and government corruption. Americans watched in horror as witness after witness revealed a web of shady deals, influence peddling, and outright bribery. The press had a field day. Republicans coined a devastating slogan for the 1952 campaign: Korea, communism, and corruption. It didn't matter that most of the corruption was minor. It didn't matter that much of it predated Truman's presidency. It didn't matter that Truman himself was scrupulously honest, so honest that after leaving office he would refuse corporate board positions and lucrative speaking fees because he believed it would be selling the office of the presidency. What mattered was the perception, the narrative, the story that the press and the opposition were telling. Harry Truman couldn't control his own government. And then came the ultimate betrayal. In January of 1952, Senator Kever, a member of Truman's own party, a Democrat, announced he would challenge the sitting president for the nomination. Kever positioned himself as the anti-corruption crusader, the fresh face who would clean up the mess in Washington. Truman was furious. He initially wasn't planning to enter the New Hampshire primary at all. But when Kever filed, Truman's supporters convinced him to put his name on the ballot. It would be a show of strength, a reminder that Harry Truman was still a fighter. On March 11, 1952, New Hampshire voters delivered their verdict. Kever, 55%. Truman, 44%. A sitting president had lost a primary in his own party. Within hours, the phone in the Oval Office began to ring. Democratic leaders, party officials, even some of Truman's own advisors whispered the same advice. Mr. President, you can't win. But here's what made the situation truly unbearable, truly impossible. Truman knew they were probably right. Act 3, the turning point. The decision, 10-13. In the 2 weeks following the New Hampshire defeat, President Harry Truman did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He confronted the brutal truth of his situation. He sat alone in the Oval Office late at night, reading the reports, the approval ratings, the internal party polls, assessments from Democratic leaders across the country. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. If he ran in 1952, he would likely lose. And if he somehow won the nomination, he would drag down Democratic candidates across the nation. The Korean War showed no signs of ending. American casualties mounted daily. Peace talks had stalled. Every day brought news of more American boys killed in action, more families receiving telegrams they had dreaded. The corruption scandals wouldn't stop. Even though Truman had cleaned house, firing Attorney General J. Howard McGrath and reorganizing the tax collection service, the damage to his reputation was permanent. Republicans would hang Korea, communism, and corruption around his neck like a millstone. And there was something else, something more personal, something that Truman confided only to his closest friends and to his diary. He was tired, bone-tired, not just physically, though at 68, he certainly felt the weight of the office, but spiritually exhausted. 7 years of making decisions that sent young men to die. 7 years of being vilified by the press, attacked by Congress, mocked by comedians. 7 years of carrying burdens that would have crushed most men. His wife Bess wanted to go home to Independence, Missouri. She had never wanted to be First Lady. She had destroyed most of her correspondence and refused to give interviews because she despised the spotlight. Now, after 7 years in the White House, she was desperate to return to their modest house on Delaware Street, to live out their remaining years in peace. And then there was the question that haunted Truman more than any other. What would serve his country best? If he ran and lost, as seemed likely, he would become a lame duck president for his final months in office, unable to govern effectively while the Korean War raged on. If he ran and won, he would spend 4 more years fighting the same battles, making the same impossible choices, all while his approval rating remained in the basement. But if he stepped aside, he could give the Democratic Party a fresh start. He could let someone new, someone untainted by the scandals and the failures, lead the party into the election. He could leave office with his dignity intact, rather than being rejected by the voters who had elevated him in 1948. It was a choice between ego and service, between what he wanted and what the country needed, between holding on to power and letting it go. On March 29, 1952, at that Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner, President Harry Truman made his choice. After 26 minutes of vintage Truman attacking Republicans, defending his record, rallying the Democratic base, he reached the end of his prepared speech. The crowd prepared to applaud. They expected him to announce his candidacy for re-election. Instead, he pulled out a single sheet of paper he had kept folded in his jacket pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read words that only a handful of people in the room had known were coming. "I shall not be a candidate for re-election," he said. His voice was firm, but those close to the podium could see the emotion in his eyes. "I have served my country long, and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel that it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts of no, women crying, reporters scrambling for phones, his own staff sitting in stunned silence. The failed shopkeeper Truman, the man who had defied every expectation, had just made the most unexpected decision of all. He had walked away from power when he could have kept fighting for it. The immediate aftermath of Truman's announcement was chaos. Democrats scrambled to find a candidate. Truman had hoped to recruit Supreme Court Chief Justice Fred Vincent, but Vincent declined. He had even briefly hoped that General Dwight Eisenhower might run as a Democrat, but Eisenhower instead became the Republican nominee. Eventually, the party nominated Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, an eloquent, intellectual politician who would lose to Eisenhower in a landslide that November. Republicans rejoiced. They thought they had broken Truman, that they had forced him from office. Senator Robert Taft crowed that the president had been driven out by his own failures, but they misunderstood what had happened. Truman hadn't been forced out. He had chosen to leave. There's a profound difference. In his final year in office, freed from the pressures of campaigning, Truman focused on governing. He continued to push for civil rights legislation. Even though Southern Democrats blocked his efforts, he worked to bring the Korean War to an honorable conclusion. Though the armistice won't be signed until July of 1953, after he left office, he gave his successor, President Eisenhower, a dignified transition, even though their relationship had soured during the campaign. On January 20th, 1953, Harry and Bess Truman boarded a train to Independence, Missouri. Unlike modern ex-presidents, Truman had no Secret Service protection after leaving office. He had no presidential pension. Congress wouldn't create one until 1958. He had no corporate board memberships or lucrative speaking deals, which he refused on principle. He lived quietly in his house on Delaware Street, writing his memoirs, overseeing the creation of his presidential library, and taking daily walks through his neighborhood, often stopping to chat with neighbors. He lived simply, even modestly, surviving on his Army pension and his wife's inheritance. For years, Truman remained deeply unpopular. A Gallup poll in 1952 showed his approval rating at 32% as he left office. Historians initially ranked him as a below-average president. Critics continued to attack his record on Korea, on corruption, on civil rights. But then, something remarkable happened. As the years passed, as new documents emerged, as historians gained perspective on the challenges Truman had faced and the decisions he had made, the verdict began to change. They recognized that Truman had presided over the transition from World War II to the Cold War, establishing NATO, implementing the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, and containing Soviet expansion without triggering World War III. They acknowledged that his decision to integrate the armed forces through executive order, despite fierce opposition, had been an act of moral courage that paved the way for the civil rights movement. They admitted that firing MacArthur, though politically devastating, had preserved civilian control over the military and prevented a potentially catastrophic wider war with China. They understood that Truman's plain-spoken honesty, his refusal to profit from the presidency, and his genuine humility stood in stark contrast to the scandals that would later plague other administrations. By the 1970s and 80s, Truman's reputation had been transformed. Historians consistently ranked him among the near-great presidents. Books celebrated his courage and integrity. The man who left office with a 22% approval rating became a folk hero, a symbol of authentic American leadership. And his decision not to run in 1952, that choice that seemed like surrender, like failure, like weakness, history revealed it as perhaps his finest moment. Because here's what Truman understood that March evening, what the crowd in that ballroom couldn't see. Real leadership isn't about clinging to power. It's about knowing when to let go. It's about putting the country before your ego. It's about having the wisdom to recognize when you've given everything you have to give, and the courage to step aside so someone else can try. Truman could have run in 1952. He was legally eligible. He might have even won the nomination, though the general election would have been brutal. But he asked himself a different question. Not, can I win, but should I run? And he concluded that serving his country meant stepping aside. The man. Everyone dismissed as a failed shopkeeper. Truman, the accidental president, who inherited an office he never sought, had the wisdom and the courage to walk away from the most powerful position on earth because he believed it was the right thing to do. So why didn't Truman run in 1952? Yes, the polls looked terrible. Yes, the scandals had damaged him. Yes, he was tired and his wife wanted to go home. Yes, he had lost New Hampshire to Keith Hoverver. But the real reason, the deepest reason, was simpler and more profound than any of that. Harry Truman understood that true strength sometimes looks like surrender. That real leadership means knowing when to step aside. That serving your country doesn't always mean holding on to power. Sometimes it means letting go. In an age when politicians cling to office until death, when ambition overrides judgment, when ego trumps service, there's something almost revolutionary about a man who simply said, "I've done my best. It's time for someone else." The failed shopkeeper from Independence, Missouri, the man nobody thought could handle the presidency, had one final lesson to teach us: that the hardest decision a leader can make isn't about power. It's about knowing when to walk away from it. If you don't want to miss more true stories about the people everyone dismissed who went on to shape the world, hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. When in your life have you had to choose between holding on and letting go? What did you learn from that decision?